Hi, Matho50 folks. Yes, it's me. Hi. So today we're going to continue 11.1 with going over factor by grouping. So my first example might be just a little bit hard to follow, but I think you'll get it as we continue. So what I'm showing you here is that this group right here has a common factor that has been factored out. So x squared has been factored out of x plus 1. And in this group, the 2 has been factored out of x plus 1. Because the x plus 1s are just the same, we're going to call them a common binomial factor. So if you see this situation where you have a number that's been factored out, and you know that because it's outside the parentheses, and then you have another number that's been factored out and it's the same binomial factor, then you can do factor by grouping. There's other ways to find this as well. But when it looks like this, what you do is you put in parentheses those numbers that were factored out. We call those greatest common factor factors. Greatest common factors factors. There's a plus sign in between them, so you put a plus. Sometimes that'll be a minus, but in this case it was a plus. And then I'll write the 2. And then you put that binomial common factor in one of the parentheses. And it doesn't matter which of these parentheses you write first. A lot of times people like to write the x plus 1, that's the binomial factor first. So that's basically how you begin factoring something like this. And remember, it works because both of them have the common x plus 1, and both of them had a common factor that was factored out. Okay, so let's do another factor by grouping, and the way that I'm going to show you now is how most factor by groupings are written just a little bit differently. So most factor by grouping you're going to recognize because there's going to be 4 terms. So if you look at our first example, which is in the middle of the handout, it's A, B plus 3A plus BC plus 3C. Okay, so when you're factor by grouping, there isn't a common factor with all 3 terms. So you see that these guys have C's in common. There's a 3 in common with this 3. There's an A in common with the first 2 terms. There's a B in common with the B and the C. But they all don't have the same common factor. So what you do is you start with the first 2 factors that are presented to you, and you factor out the common factor. So in this case, it's an A. So I put that in front of the parentheses. And so A times what would give me AB? A B. I factored out an A, so that means the 3 would be what I would need to put in that second spot. So B plus 3. Then, because there's a plus here, I'm going to put a plus sign. Then I look at my last 2 terms and I factor them. Well, you can see that they both have a C, so their common factor would be a C. And then what would I need to multiply C by to get BC? Well, just a B. What would I need to multiply C by to get 3C? A positive 3. Because you've got these 2 common parentheses, the binomial factors, that means that you can group them, just one of them, as a common factor, and then the numbers that you factored out as the greatest common factor, you put them in a second parenthesis. And so this is called factor by grouping. Okay, so we'll practice a few of these, and hopefully you will get it by that time. So again, to save room, I'm going to erase this. So if you need to look back at that, then please just stop the video and rewind it. Okay, so you try it 1. we've got x squared minus x plus 5x minus 5. And you can see on the handout that I gave you that I wrote 3 steps. The first step is to factor out the common factor from the first 2 terms. So the common factor would be the x. Then what would I need to multiply the x by to get x squared? Well, another x. What would I need to multiply x by to get a negative x? That means it would have to be a negative 1. The second step says factor out the common factor from the third and the fourth term. So third term, fourth term, common factor looks like it's going to be 5. Since there's a plus sign in front of the 5, I'm going to put plus 5. So a positive 5 times what would give me 5x, an x. A positive 5 times what would give me a negative 5, a negative 1. So notice that I have these common groups again, so I just pull one of them out, and I have x minus 1. Then I put in a group those greatest factors that I factored out, and so I just put x. Since there's a plus sign here, I put a plus 5. Okay. All right, well, let's look at number 2. So number 2, you've got 6x squared minus 4x minus 3x plus 2. So we look at the first 2 terms. It looks like they have a common factor of 2. They also have a common x, and then I make my parenthesis. 2x times what would give me 6x squared? Well, it would have to be 2 times 3x. Then I look at the second term. What would I need to multiply 2 by to get a negative 4? It would have to be a negative 2. No x, because the x was already pulled out as the greatest common factor. So just 3x minus 2. Okay. Then I look at the next 2 terms. There's a negative sign between them, so I'm going to put a minus. They don't have a common factor other than 1, so their common factor is going to be a negative 1. So then I make my parenthesis. A negative 1 times what would give me a negative 3x? Well, it would have to be a positive 3x, since a negative times a positive give me a negative. What would I multiply a negative 1 by to get a positive 2? It would have to be a negative 2. A negative 2 times a negative 1 gives me a positive 2. Okay, so now that I've done that part of the factoring, because the 3x and the minus 2 both were common binomial factors, I write them in a parenthesis. And then I've got the 2x and the negative 1, and I put those in another parenthesis. And that is the factor by grouping for number 2. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at You Try It 3. You Try It 3 is x squared plus 5x minus 4x minus 20. So we look at the first 2 terms and we see that we've got a common x. So we pull the x out. X times what would give me x squared? X. X times what would give me a positive 5x? A positive 5. Then we look at the second 2 terms. There's a negative out in front, so I have to put a negative sign. So what would I multiply this by, well, first of all, what would the common factor be? It looks like it'd be a -4, so I'll put the 4 beside it. So what would I need to multiply a -4 by to get a -4x? It would have to be a positive 1x. So I'm just going to write the x. If you want to write that 1, you can. But I'll leave it just x. What would I need to multiply a -4 by to get a -20? It would have to be a positive 5. So now I see that my two parentheses are exactly the same. And then I will group my greatest common factors, the x and the -4, and I'm finished. So as you're factoring these, notice that there may be times where these parentheses are not the same. If they're not the same, usually it means you've pulled out something wrong or you set it up wrong. So if they're not the same, you should go back and figure out, what did I do? And try again. Very rarely will you have two different things at this level. And if you do, then you just stop the factoring, say it's no longer factorable. And that does happen every once in a while. All right. I have a couple more for you to do. So let's look at You Try It 4. So You Try It 4, we've got x squared plus 5x plus 12x plus 60. Okay, so we look at the first two terms and they have an x in common. Then we make our parenthesis. X times what gives me x squared? X. X times x. X times what would give me 5x? A 5. And then I end my parenthesis. Then I look at the second two terms. There's a plus sign, so I'm going to put a plus there. 12x and 60 have 12 in common. 12 times what gives me 12x? X. 12 times what gives me 60? 5. So they have a common x plus 5, and then they have a common x plus 12 as the greatest common factors. And there you finished factoring that one. Okay, so let's look at the next one, which is You Try It 7. No, wait a minute. I jumped ahead. Number 5, sorry. So number 5, we've got x squared minus 2x minus 8x plus 16. So you look at the first two terms and they have a common x. So x times x gives me x squared, and then we've got a minus 2. There's a minus sign here, so I'm going to put that between the two parentheses. We've got a -8 and 16, so 8 would be the common factor. So what would I need to multiply a -8 by to get a -8x? I'd have to have an x there. What would I need to multiply a -8 by to get a positive 16? It would have to be a -2. X minus 2 is a common binomial factor, and our greatest common factors were x minus 8, so I put them in another parenthesis. Okay. All right, I think we have time to do another one. So let's go ahead and do You Try It 6. So You Try It 6, you get 2x squared plus x minus 10x minus 5. Okay, so in the first two terms, the only thing they have in common is an x, so I pull it out. Then I make my parenthesis. X times what would give me 2x squared? Well, it would have to be 2x. These are exactly the same, so the common factor has to be a 1. And then I end my parenthesis. Now I look at the second two terms. Because there's a negative sign in between them, we've got a negative. So a common factor of a negative 10 and a negative 5 would have to be a negative 2. A negative 2 times what would give me a negative 10x? I goofed up. That happens sometimes. I'm just going to erase. There we go. Okay, these have a 5 in common, and I bet you guys saw that. There we go. So a negative 5 times what would give me a negative 10x? It would have to be a positive 2x. A negative 5 times what would give me a negative 5? It would have to be a positive 1. So we have our common binomial factor of 2x plus 1. And then we also have the x minus the 5. Okay, all right. So I think that's our last one. Yeah, it is. So that's factor by grouping, and that is in 11.1. And again, if you have some questions, be sure to ask them during our Zoom meeting. Have a good day, guys.